I will take this opportunity to announce our next session, which is quite an interesting title. It's called Confessions of a Participant in the Supply Chain. With us is Brian Hajost. He's the founder and COO of SteelCloud, a company that develops technology for automated compliance for DISA STIGs and the CIS security benchmarks. Brian made SteelCloud into a recognized leader in delivering new technologies, allowing government customers and commercial enterprises to meet the compliant mandates of the risk management framework, NIST 853, NIST 800-171, CMMC, and IRS Pub 1075. Brian's technical career has spanned over 30 years, primarily with leading-edge technologies in regulated industries. He holds 12 patents in IT securities and 2 in mobile security, and he's an active participant in AFCEA and ATARC thought leadership programs. Are you out there, Brian?
I am.
You're all set. Take it away, Brian.
Well, wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure speaking to you today. I got a rather long introduction there. My talk today is going to be informed by 3 things in my background. One is running a software company that's currently part of the federal government supply chain. 2 is my involvement as the chair for the ATARC CATO working group, and the other as one of the leads of the AFCEA subcommittee on supply chain. Now, CATO and supply chain may seem to be pretty far apart, but they really aren't. A lot of my work in the past has been around the RMF process, and I see the changes that are being made for supply chain are really going to affect organizations going through the RMF process. So with that, let's I'll bring up an agenda. We're going to touch upon the mandates, the government mandates, and how they impact software suppliers like myself. We'll review some best practices in how supply chain complicates organizational structures in the government and their mission partners, how it complicates workflows and impacts RMF and ATOs. My gift for today is to provide a overview framework on how to simplify all of those mandates so you can make positive pressure going forward. And I will provide perspective on positive steps that you can take immediately. With that, I'm going to go off camera because I wave my arms around and I don't want to distract you. So why are we even talking about supply chain? You know, sometimes it's viewed as something off to the side, but I want to re-emphasize the fact that some of the other presenters that supply chain security is cybersecurity. It's one and the same. We know from the SolarWinds hack that supply chain has dramatic effects no matter the quality of the software implementation. So let's keep that in mind, that we're really addressing cybersecurity when we talk about supply chain security. Let me go back to the origins and what has affected vendors like myself. And I'll go back to what I consider the origin of the modern supply chain, which was the Executive Order 13556, and that was the classification of CUI data. And that was important not because it was the classification of CUI data, but because it led to NIST 800-171, which was a mandate from the federal government on its suppliers on how it is going to protect, how the suppliers are going to protect federal information that is unclassified. It was one of the first major mandates outside of classified information. That led to the supplier performance risk management system, and also led to CMMC and the initiatives in the civilian government that are CMMC-like. So again, all this in 13556 was based around data. And so fast forward 10 years later, we have Executive Order 14028, and 14028 is mentioned in virtually every document on cybersecurity and on supply chain security. And it really, its major premise was the only way the government can protect itself was that it partners with the private sector. And so a lot of things in the 14028, but two main things that we'll talk about today. One is SBOM, the software bill of materials requirement was created, and the other is definition of critical software. And by critical software, we're not talking about important software or mission critical software. We're talking about software that runs at elevated permissions or manages privileges, has access to privileges or operational systems. In general, it performs a function critical to trust. It is the type of software that affects all the other software in an infrastructure. And the reason the identification of critical software is so important is that critical software will have better and more enhanced supply chain requirements, more critical evaluation, more artifacts, and that type of thing. So as you go forward with strategies for securing your supply chain for software, recognize that critical software has a slightly different track than most other software. Now, since the executive order came out, there's been a bunch of things that have happened and documents that were produced. NIST 853 Rev 5. So the big change in Rev 5 from Rev 4 is that a whole section of supply chain was created with 12 new controls. Supply chain is referenced 200 times in Rev 5. And for most organizations, whether they be organizations in FedRAMP or federal implementations, Rev 5 will be new for them. So a lot of new supply chain information. Also 800-161, which are practices around supply chain. Again, a lot more guidance linked back to 853 and RMF as to what the government organization needs to do to manage supply chains. More in software development, which I'm more involved in, is 800-218, is actually a development framework. How do you protect the development environment? Along with that, it was a really useful document produced by NSA, ODNI, and CISA around practices for people like SteelCloud to securely develop software for the government. Now, OMB Memorandum 2218 came out and really directed the federal agencies to adopt 800-218. So again, another big thing all this has come out since the executive order. So when you look at industry and the mandates on industry or what we have to do, there's a whole bunch of things the government has to do, but what industry has to do are dictated 800-171, again, around the protection of data. CMMC as a program for certification of organizations, protection of the data. FedRAMP, as many of you are aware of, is for software as a service, and the 853 like requirements you have to get a FedRAMP certification. And something that's rather new, and hopefully most of you are tracking this, is we've been tracking for the last year, the DHS CISA Secure Software Attestation Form. And this is important for a couple of reasons. One, authority was from the executive order. The purpose was to give the government the assurance that third-party software developers like SteelCloud are following secure software development protocols. It involves the False Claims Act. So again, it imposes some legality on the software vendor. And it's for software developed after September 14th of 2022. Not sure why that date was changed. The other major thing, as opposed to all the other attestations that we make, certs and reps and flow downs and the rest, this document has to be signed by the CEO or the COO. So it's the leadership of the software organization putting their name on a document that gives the assurances to the federal organization that secure practices have been adopted and are in place. So let's look at the RMF process and the way it's worked in the past. Before supply chain was a big ingredient in RMF, as it is in 853 Rev 5. You know, you go through an evaluation, you get into acquisition, you get to RMF, and you get into production. And what you look at is in terms of risk, is that most of the risk is evaluated in the RMF stage. After the technical evaluation, after the purchase, most of it's done there. That doesn't work as well when you are dealing with supply chain and the supply chain ingredients into the authorization process. So if you do it the way you've normally done it and do all the things in each of the steps going into production you normally have, you will find that many times in the RMF process, you're going to hit major issues dealing with supply chain. Could be a key component that is developed in a country that you are not comfortable with. It could be a vendor that is unwilling to sign the CISA attestation document or secure practices. There could be a lot of things. It could be change in ownership or other things that have to be evaluated as part of RMF that you find out after you've done a technical evaluation, you've done an acquisition, and now you have a boat anchor that you have to figure out what to do with. And so the advice here is that some of the things that would traditionally be purely an A&A function be moved back way earlier in the evaluation stage, so that you're evaluating risk as it involves supply chain at the very earliest stage, so that can be addressed before you go through the acquisition and get into the RMF process. So in RMF, you may have some surprises, but you don't have supply chain surprises. Excuse me. So the takeaways here from this change in the view of how this should be done and where this should be done in dealing with implementing secure supply chain is that the workflows are going to change. And some of the RMF work needs to be front-loaded. The biggest issue is going to be the organizational structure, roles, and responsibilities. Possibly people that are doing things in the past aren't going to be doing them in the future. Possibly areas that didn't do some types of work are going to have to be doing that type of work. So it's who's doing it, when's it doing it, what's being done. And again, the keys to the effectiveness of making these changes are that it's not just workflows. It may be some organizational structural and responsibility changes that you may need to look at. So the FedRAMP question, and this is, I am not a FedRAMP expert. I have tried to do my due diligence in how the supply chain will involve FedRAMP and what gets done and what gets certified. And I have as many questions as I have answers. So as you probably are aware, FedRAMP is moving to 853 Rev 5 from Rev 4. So it is just now, there are very few FedRAMP certified vendors that have gone through the Rev 5 process. So a lot of the new supply chain things have not yet been implemented. They'll be faced with those in the future. But the key question is, what are the agency responsibilities? FedRAMP is a certification, it's not an ATO. Every agency will treat the certification differently, whether they need low, moderate, high, what they also have to do. But if you look at FedRAMP, which primarily deals with 853, NIST 802.18 and the OMB memorandum are not even mentioned in 5361 or 171. And the attestation form is also outside of that. So the question, and it is a question of what is inside the FedRAMP certification and what lays outside dealing with secure supply chain that a federal agency will have to deal with. So if you look at the guidance, think of 853, 171, 161 as cyber infrastructure and operations kinds of things. And then cyber software development operations are kind of completely separate. So it is not unreasonable to think that FedRAMP will take care of cyber infrastructure operations and some of the supply chain issues that are dealt with in 853, but the actual development operations and that type of thing may fall outside of FedRAMP. And clearly, it's not an area that the FedRAMP auditors have had to deal with in the past. But as you think about supply chain, think about, and FedRAMP, think about it this way. If you're a software supplier that delivers software directly to a government agency, the government, with the new mandates, will go and ensure that the software is developed correctly. But excuse me, one would expect that in a SaaS environment, the same responsibility exists. Where is the software being used in the SaaS environment? Is it being developed correctly? How are you doing vulnerabilities and that type of thing? So a good way to look at how to look at FedRAMP and some of the issues that may be involved there. So if you look at all the government mandates and information, the FARs, CMMC, it really is a pile of mandates. And I would suggest that if you start from the control up, it's going to be a really hard road. So I think in looking at supply chain and your external software vendors, I'm suggesting a new framework to look at this, which I will go through. There are 5 key software areas to look at. First is software quality, component quality, and I separate those two out because component quality really involves things that are new to this evaluation area. Development process quality. The fourth one that many people forget is the software implementation quality. And then the fifth one is vendor quality. So if you take all the mandates, all of the security controls, they will fit in one of these 5 areas regarding supply chain. And so it's the vendor's responsibility to deliver these 5 things adequately to their customer. Now I'm going to go through each one of these individually. Software quality, this is more traditional. It's static code analysis, penetration testing, things like the application development STIG. There's one suggestion that I would make that I don't see many of our government customers doing is when I see them in RMF struggling, if they're doing the application development STIG, doing questionnaires and filling this out themselves, I would suggest that government customers ask their vendors to do this and supply it to them. Now, vendors will be somewhat resistant because the application development STIG is very big and large and strict, and no one gets an A on everything. And you never want to put, forth, this is what we're delivering and we're not an A in everything. But again, I would suggest that they do it. It probably will take a vendor for each application less than a day. Once they've done it for one government customer, it's a resource they can have for all government customers. And it's a great way to kind of shift, not the responsibility, but shift the effort off to the vendor. Software component quality. Again, software bill of materials, we've had discussions on this. I'm not going to go into detail, but the one thing that you probably should look at is software bill of materials is just not the componentry, the stuff that you get delivered from the vendor, but there's a software bill of materials for the software vendor's design environment, for their development environment, as well as their deployment or the software product they delivered to you. So again, look at the more holistic view of the software bill of materials. Qualitative judgment, the componentry. not just what it is, and it doesn't have maybe a vulnerability today, but what's its history? Is it had vulnerabilities in the past? Is this the type of component that black hatters attack all the time? There's constant updates. So there's a qualitative judgment about that software bill of materials and contingencies and dependencies. And again, it's very complex of how things tie together, but again, you need to look at that in the context of the software bill of materials. Software development process quality. Again, software bill of materials and vulnerability. This isn't the software bill of materials, but what is the vendor's process for maintaining the software bill of materials? What is their process for recognizing vulnerabilities in the components that they develop and deliver? What's the tempo process in communicating that to their government customers? That's all part of quality. And the other, besides just the coding process, the release process, support processes, the physical security of their environments, the ownership of their environments, and where is it being done, physically where it's being done. So those things all come into the software process quality. Implementation's been around forever. Many people forget about it to RMF. So standards, the organization or the implementation or program, what are the standards for things like multi-factor FIPS, questionnaires about things that are required by the given organization. But just as importantly is the cocoon in which the software lives. You can have the most secure software, the best developed software, the best processes, but when it's implemented in a government environment, it creates a cocoon that's insecure. So are there external transmissions of data, external access to infrastructure, meaning you pierce the enclave and make it available outside of itself? One thing that many government organizations don't ask is, has it been run in a STIG environment? Not has it been run in the government STIG environment, but have you run it in your test labs in a STIG environment? And if you have, give me a list of Cat 1s, Cat 2s, and Cat 3s. We've helped a lot of software vendors through this process, but again, it shortcuts and ensures that you don't get in an RMF with, Cat 1s and Cat 2s that you can't live with, or you have to mitigate around or slow down the entire process. And lastly is vendor quality. Again, there's our traditional methods that were used by acquisition and the FARs, SAM, FARs and DFARs, certs and reps, ITAR, all of the questions. You paid your taxes, you're not been debarred, you don't use this, you don't use minerals, you don't use telecommunications from a country that is not permissible. But the new considerations have to do also with monitoring and changes. And it'll be different program by program, agency by agency. Where are they located? Where are they managed? Where are they developed location? Who are the owners and investors? Financial stability. Any program specific practices, based on, the risk profile of the program. And if they are processing CUI data or handling CUI data, where are they in the 171 and CMMC process? Again, you'd hate to get to way down the road in terms of your ATO process and find out that the vendor has CUI data and is months away from being certified for something they need to. So one of the suggestions that I would make is that you create a checklist, and I don't want that to be a negative term. I don't mean a compliance checklist. I just mean a list of the things that you're going to evaluate in each step. And primarily what we're talking about are things that had traditionally been done in the RMF process or done in the evaluation process around supply chain, quality of vendor, quality of software, the vendor being prepared to supply the government the things they need to support their secure supply chain initiatives. So it could be as much as just a paragraph of definitions. You're going to do this, what or when, down to more programmatic checklists. But again, I think it's important to decide what exactly you're going to do and what part of the process. So in terms of takeaways, I suggest the easiest way to prepare yourself, because it is a complicated task, as our last two presenters really elaborated on, is looking at that vendor framework and delineate vendor quality, software product quality, component quality, which isolates the SBOM. The development process is a discrete element, and implementation quality. Those 5 things will really help get you to where you can, satisfy all the controls in the government mandates. And then build a plan. Build a plan on understanding the new complexities, changing what was done yesterday so that you're at least no better off in terms of your ability and your agility than you were before. And, prepare for the new RMF requirements. Again, if you've not reviewed Rev 5, take a hard look at it. Identify your critical software, because you will treat that stuff differently. Inventory what you know. A lot of the answers to the questions that have been, that I presented, you already know. It just needs to be put in a format that can be used that once you get through the RMF process. As I mentioned with the checklists, who's going to do what, where in the process are you going to do it, and engage your suppliers. So this is an area that again, I think that the government doesn't ask enough of us, and we're generally very happy to help if we know what the government wants. So I think in this journey to securing a supply chain with more hand in hand with your suppliers, that you establish, maybe a closer relationship, maybe a better relationship with your suppliers, and they will help. They will help in this process. All they need to do is understand what you need. And with that, that is the end of my presentation. I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to let me sit here on the confessional and tell you what we think here as a supplier to the federal government. And if there are any questions, I will take them.
Brian, thank you very much for that excellent presentation, and I love the animation in that closing slide. We have 2 questions. One, Susan and Jane out in the audience asked, will slides be provided after the webinar? This presentation, we have a poll question immediately following it here in the next minute, and that's your opportunity to ask for a copy of this presentation. But I have one question for you, Brian, and then we'll go to the poll question because we have 2 minutes here. Where would you suggest to the government staff out there they can get more involved in some of the organizations that are, handling securing the supply chain? Can you elaborate on that?
Well, a couple that I know of, and I'm sure that there are many that I don't know of. I think in the AFCEA subcommittee on supply chain, we certainly would like to have a lot more government participation. But I think also, and what I really, really welcome more government participation is in the RTOC CATO working group. I mean, this is where we're working through all the issues around RMF and ATOs and re-ATOing, which will increasingly be secure supply chain will become more important. And I think I sit back and listen. I sit back and listen to the government's problems, how the government is solving the problems, the issues, opportunities, best practices. And I think that's a great venue to share and get information around how supply chain affects the ATO process.
Well, Brian, thank you for joining us today. Excellent presentation. Let's go to our poll question. Okay, regarding Brian's excellent presentation on confessions of our participant in the supply chain presentation, this is your opportunity. They have a thought leadership piece called 5 Lessons of the Federal Software Supply Chain Trenches. If you'd like a copy of that, you can select the first thing there. Have a SteelCloud subject matter expert contact me to continue the discussion. 3, send a copy of today's presentation. Then all of the above. That would be to get a copy of the 5 lessons, to have a SteelCloud subject matter expert contact me, and get a copy of today's presentation, or nothing at this time. This is your opportunity. I do not know if it would be Brian that would speak with you, but we will leave this poll question up for a few more seconds.
And I would like to add that my phone and my email address is here. I would love to take a call or get an email from any of the folks out there. So feel free to reach out to me directly.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian.